Mr. Commissioner, just a little bit of housekeeping. We're back with our panel, of course. Mr. Wilson may have to leave at 3, so I've talked to the other participants to find out how we can make sure that people are able to ask him questions who want to do so. And so we'll start with Mr. Eidsvik, who is here today representing the Southern Area Eel Netters and BC Fisheries Survival Coalition. And then we'll follow with Ms. Gartner. And hopefully all the questions for Mr. Wilson will be completed by 3, and then we'll carry on with the West Coast Troller Area G, which is Mr. Watson, and then the BC Wildlife Federation, Mr. Lowe's.
Good afternoon, Commissioner. My name is Philip Eidsvik, E-I-D-S-V-I-K. It's not an easy name to spell. And I'm here on behalf of the Area Gill Netters and the BC Fisheries Survival Coalition. And I have a number of questions to ask off both panel members. And I'm not as interested in the workings of FRSSI as I am interested in why FRSSI. And perhaps, Mr. Staley, you can help me a little bit and give us a very short history of Fraser River sockeye. Am I correct in saying we had pretty good abundance until the Hell's Gate slides?
I believe so, yes. The data, though, is on the catch, not on the escapement. There are no escapement data from
That's true.
the period.
And then we had a long period of rebuilding following the installation of fish ladders. And then in about the 60s, we hit another low in the early 60s.
Yes, sir.
And then a fairly successful rebuilding program until about 1990.
The abundance increased into early 90s, yes.
At that time, it's fair to say that I think you were involved in management then, and a number of people that we've heard so far were that fishery managers, Fraser River sockeye managers, had a kind of a worldwide reputation through the 60s, 70s, and 80s as doing impressive work.
Certainly many of the, some of the managers who were also scientists were also ended up in the academic field, and you think of people like Dr. Larkin, for example, and Dr. Ricker, who worked for DFO. They sort of were world leaders in the population dynamics of salmon and recognized as such.
Yeah, well, but perhaps at this point I'll open it up to the panel members. What I'm curious about is why FRSSI? We had a really good fisheries management model from the 60s to the early 90s that successfully rebuilt runs, and we could go back to the 40s and go to the 90s. Why the need for FRSSI? We didn't have FRSSI during this tremendous rebuilding period. Why the need for FRSSI?
Mr. Commissioner, I think one of the the history is important to understand. Yes, we had come off of a good series of years in rebuilding, and but I think times have changed recently too, because we now have the wild sound policy, although FRSSI by a couple of years predates that. But certainly the thinking about how you deal with the trade-offs in a consistent way within a framework that takes advantage of the fisheries science that exists. So and I think, as Rob Morley had pointed out, the modeling capability is with fancy new desktop computers and laptops is enhanced. But really, I think it's a way to look at how you trade off escapement on the conservation side, but also with the need to ensure that you have escapement for future sustainability, and to trade off with the socioeconomic side of things. So, but I think the main point is that it allowed for consistent assessment and evaluation of trade-offs. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, I guess my point is we obviously had a lot of trade-offs through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. In some years, we probably took less fish than we wanted to for that rebuilding effort. At the end of the 1980s, we could be pretty proud that most runs were in much better shape than 30 years earlier. So we had a really effective fishery management model. And what I'm trying to figure out is why we abandoned that model and now we've stepped into FRSSI. Are we trying to solve problems that happened between 1990 and 8 years ago when we developed FRSSI?
I guess specifically, sorry, Mr. Commissioner, the existing rebuilding plan, the so-called 1987 rebuilding plan, was rules-based, as is FRSSI, but it was designed to, at a minimum, maintain escapements, but also to increase escapements on the brood year, so not go backwards, and so that works okay in a situation where abundance is stable or increasing. But as in the 90s, when things declined, the plan that was in place then would have been difficult to continue implementing because of declines and the inability to maintain broods as in the rebuilding phase.
So what were the reasons for the declines in the 90s?
I mean, there's a list of hypotheses, if you like. Not sure you want me to go into that, but...
Well, I think it's useful because you said that FRSSI is a response to problems and declines in the 90s. So I think it's helpful if we understand what the reasons for the decline were and how FRSSI responded to those particular problems.
Yeah, I'm not sure, Mr. Commissioner, the reasons for the decline were an issue with FRSSI, although certainly within the model there needs to be some understanding or some way to develop future scenarios, if you like, or scenarios for the future. But the fact is, we don't know what the reasons are for the decline. There's hypotheses that are described to explain them, but the fact is it was in response to a decline, and the causes of it were unexplained. And FRSSI was, the 1987 rebuilding plan was targeted for a 12 to 16 years, and which takes us up to whatever that is, 2002, in that range, 2005. So it had, that rebuilding phase had reached its limit, if you like, in terms of what initially was planned.
So I think that helps a little bit, but it doesn't answer my question. I'm just trying to get why FRSSI now, what problem does FRSSI solve? And does anybody else want to take a crack at that?
Mr. Commissioner, I guess just to sort of expand a little bit on the sort of the history as to how we got here, I think when the IPSFC was managing Fraser Sockeye and setting escapement goals for that period of time of long rebuilding from the time they took over management after building the fishways up through the 50s and the 60s into the 70s and the 80s, that the general approach was one of trying to have fairly significant fisheries virtually every year, but certainly to have escapement goals that looked at building the populations in a measured way, instead of looking at sort of doubling escapement in any one population from one cycle to the next. Look at a gradual increase in the escapement goal and see what the response was. And as was indicated, there was a gradual increase in the runs over that time period. The radical departure to that kind of policy came about, I think, as has been described in the rebuilding strategy of 1987, where Canada decided that that approach was too slow, and that there were greater gains to be made by having massive increases of escapement, that we would hopefully see a significant response and have increased yields to the fisheries in Canada, given that the Americans were now capped under the Salmon Treaty at a fixed total number, and not getting 50% of whatever was caught in the convention waters. And I think clearly so that was one significant change that happened, and how the stocks responded to that is you're going to hear a lot more about, I think, in the next panel on over-escapement and theories as to what the response to those massive escapements that we've been putting on the ground since then are. But certainly that is one of the potential reasons why we have seen some of the stocks decline, in particular some of the more populous stocks like quenelle. And you can look at those stocks as being the ones that actually now have the lowest productivity. So it's not the small stocks that are the weak ones, it's actually the biggest ones that are currently facing the worst productivity as a result of massive over-escapements. But the other confounding factor that comes into this in terms of, so the clearly the rebuilding strategy had some drawbacks, as Dr. Cass has mentioned, and it resulted in having to look to a new approach here that would be a made-in-Canada approach. So the question, I don't think at this point, given that the escapement goals have been increased so dramatically, that people were prepared to go back and look at reducing them to what they had been prior to the Canada taking over management responsibility. So we needed to have some way to analyze it. FRSSI is a tool, but as I think we have talked about here, it's only a tool to analyze the potential impacts of different harvest rules and spawning escapements. The two other confounding factors sort of happened here in the sort of 1990s is we started to see, well, three other factors. We started to see high water temperatures and en route losses. We started to see early entry of the late runs, and again, associated high mortalities with that. And we had the Sparrow decision and a change in the allocation and a change in the amount of fishing that was taking place within the river, sort of all the way from the mouth up through the canyon. And all of those things had an impact on what was happening to Fraser sockeye as they were going up towards the spawning grounds. And clearly we needed to try to figure out how to develop an escapement and harvest rule in response to all that. How they all play out and where the sort of cause and effect in these things are is very difficult to sort out. Yeah. But certainly, so FRSSI's response to that, in terms of how good it is as a response to that, is a question that I have, certainly.
Yeah. So maybe to sum up then, we had successful fisheries management from about 1940 to 1990, had a cautious plan for escapement, and FRSSI is responding to problems from 1990 onwards. That Mr. Morley's given some sense of what they might be. Mr. Cass is reluctant to. Just Mr. Staley or Mr. Wilson, do you have anything to add to that? Okay. Maybe I can go to fisheries management, and I know FRSSI is an attempt to control fishing effort. Mr. Morley, I think you would agree that the lowest point in recent history of Fraser sockeye was about the 60s. We've gone over that. What was the traditional harvest rate in the commercial sector prior to the early 1990s? I think you said it's about 75 to 80%. Is that about right?
That was the traditional total harvest rate of all commercial, recreational, and First Nations fisheries.
And how many years would that harvest rate have been in place?
I mean, I think probably that harvest rate would go back to the turn of the century. And certainly in some years when there was very low abundance and low fisheries, you wouldn't have had that harvest rate every year. But for most of the years, and on average, it would be in that range.
And from the perspective of a fishery manager in 2010, we had a much bigger commercial fleet. Roughly how many seiners would have fished on Fraser River sockeye prior to fleet reduction?
I think at the maximum number of seiners, there was over 500 seine boats.
And how many now?
There are.
If the full southern fleet fished.
The southern fleet is, I think there's 169 licenses, but in terms of active vessels, I would suggest there's on a given year there wouldn't be more than 130 or so.
Now, any change in fishing techniques has lowered the productivity rate of the seine fleet in the last, say, 10 years, 15 years?
The seine fleet is now required to braille all their catches, so they can't use their drums to drum in the net, and so when they make a set, they have to slowly dip out a couple hundred fish at a time and sort the fish to put back live all of the non-retention species like Chinook.
Any sense? Do you remember how big the troll fleet was on Fraser sockeye prior to fleet reduction?
I don't have it. I mean, it was
substantially bigger.
Substantial. The fleet is probably.
Mr. Commissioner, we are having a whole section on commercial fisheries coming up as soon as we finish harvest management, and I wonder if the questions might be more appropriately saved for that.
Mr. Commissioner, there's a reason why and I'll be there shortly, why I'm asking these questions. If you just go with me for another minute or two. And on an average opening in the Fraser River, how many gill netters?
Currently?
Yeah, roughly.
300, 400,
compared to prior?
800, 900.
So my point is, fishery managers have a much easier job managing the commercial fleet today as compared to in the days when they had no computers, we didn't have a FRSSI model. Is that fair to say?
I think the amount of effort in the commercial sector, the sort of fishing power is certainly reduced from what it was, and that would provide them with, it would slow the rate of harvest down, and they certainly have better technology in terms of communications and monitoring catches available to them.
In the development of the FRSSI model, other than avoiding low catches, was there another model that should have been considered maybe in that? Because we have the low catch model, but I'm curious, we used to try and fish and catch a fair amount of fish. Was that considered in FRSSI?
As I think Mr. Staley pointed out, the model does certainly provide the potential harvest as an output in terms of the numbers of fish that can be taken in from any particular untiming group in any particular year. So that as one of the outputs is available, it is currently there's nothing done with that in terms of analyzing the options per se. And if you were going to look at a sort of cost-benefit kind of analysis, first of all, you'd want to really look at what that meant in terms of jobs and income to people, and so you have to translate that into numbers of fish, into where it might be caught, what it might be worth in terms of commercial value, and what the costs of accessing it might be. So it's a fairly detailed analysis that has not been attempted with through this model.
Yeah, and that brings me to the role of fish scientists in development of FRSSI models and issues like that. And Mr. Cass, maybe you can help me. Is it traditional for a DFO scientist to take an advocacy position, say for weak stock management or high escapement or low escapement, or is their job to say, here's what will happen if you do high escapement, here's what will happen if you do low? Can you fill us in a little bit on that?
Yes, Mr. Commissioner. The point of the science is to be objective and to assess data and build models or platforms for analyzing data. It doesn't have the role in advocacy as you have questioned.
Thank you. Now, for Mr. Staley and Mr. Wilson, both of you represent interest groups that have interest in the fishery. When you're a fish scientist, these groups must have retained you for a reason. Can you give me some assistance on that? Why would a fish group want a scientist working for them?
Well, first of all, the organization I work for in the main right now is actually a joint First Nation DFO organization, so it's not strictly working for First Nations in that capacity. But in other cases, I have done work for individual First Nations and First Nations groups. The reason they're interested is that they see that they have a role in management, and they ask me to help them understand some of the analysis that DFO is doing that supports the management, and to provide some explanation to them about that.
So, you're on the Fraser Technical Committee, I gather?
I'm on the Fraser Panel Technical Committee, yes.
Any other user group on that technical committee?
Not to my knowledge, no.
In your role on the technical committee or as a scientist for Aboriginal groups, have you ever argued that a public fishery, commercial or recreational, should be closed to accommodate Aboriginal fisheries in the river? And I'm not being critical of you, Mr. Staley. I'm just trying to understand what the role of science is in the management of the fishery, and whether sometimes scientists can become advocates.
I think I would, in some cases, point out when and if plans were being made for harvest, that would not be consistent with the distribution that's set out in preseason plans, and some of that distribution of catch is directed towards First Nations, as is do their the priority right that they that many people and they believe they have.
I'm not disputing those at all. In the drafting of the FRSSI model or an escapement model or a weak stock management plan or a setting escapement levels, would there be, depending on how those models are set, would there be a benefit for your clients if those models were developed one way or another?
There would be benefits, I suppose, for different groups if they were done one way or the other. Currently, I work for an organization which encompasses as on issues about where the harvest might take place. That encompasses everywhere from the marine area right up to the top of the watershed. So I think I'm not there to, which I think would probably encompass most harvesting interests or perspectives, I guess, in the interests. So my role is to be as neutral as I can, at least with the FRAFS organization, about those issues.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson, you said that you're unhappy with the FRSSI model because you thought you didn't like the 60% number, and there were some other questions about it. I'm curious, is there a general acceptable level of harvest that you would say as a rule is okay? If
no.
And why not?
Well, for example, in recent years we've seen average productivity in the Fraser decline to approximately 1, which is to say that there is no harvestable surplus because each spawner only reproduces itself. Under low productivity scenarios, there may be no harvest.
Now, so do you have an ideal escapement level then for each stock?
Do I?
Yes.
No.
How would you set an escapement level then? Like I'm saying, early Stewart Sockeye, do you have a number or
No, it's not my job to set escapement levels.
All on escapement levels. And do you accept that even in off-cycle years versus peak years, you're always trying to get to what we would say is a maximum escapement level then?
Well, we'd have to have a conversation about the role of cyclic dominance and the values we were trying to promote through the management of the resource at that time.
That wasn't what I asked. I asked, do you believe that every cycle in every year and every stock in every year should have maximum escapement? Or do you recognize that there is ups and downs?
I recognize that there's ups and downs.
Those are natural?
To some degree, yes.
Okay. Now, do you ever believe there's any point when there's too many fish in the spawning grounds?
That depends on your frame of reference. I think from the standpoint of the harvester's perspective, there are certainly going to be times when there's too many fish in the spawning grounds.
Almost done. I'm sorry, I was distracted. What was the final bit of your sentence there, your answer?
There are times when large spawning populations are unlikely to produce large harvestable surpluses in the future. So from the standpoint of maximizing harvest, it is possible to put too many fish on the spawning grounds.
How many Fraser Sockeye stocks have gone extinct in the last 100 years? Do you know?
I don't know.
Okay, what kind of condition is the early Stewart run in, as a general rule?
Well, it's recognized as a stock of concern.
And how much public commercial mixed stock fishing has occurred in that run in the last 20 years?
Well, you're probably asking the wrong person.
Mr. Morley, do you know the answer to that?
Almost none.
So, despite no public commercial fishing, we have a run that's in trouble. So, in other words, mixed stock fisheries aren't the only determinant on whether a stock can be in trouble or not. For example, it's issues like habitat, water temperature.
Well, there's a very large range of factors that affect a stock's productivity, and it's matching your harvest to the available surplus, if you want to call it that, or to the productivity of the stock that's really the art of management. I'm not suggesting that, nor have I ever suggested that commercial fisheries were solely responsible for all the ills of Fraser Sockeye.
How long has the early Stewart run been, do you call it a stock of concern or interest? Or?
Well, it went into decline. Gee, I guess it's been, in my experience, perhaps the last 15 years or so, we've been worried about it.
So the last 15 years, despite no public commercial fishing. But I guess my point is we saw it as a stock of concern and virtually no public commercial fishing on it. There was no frizzies, there was no tams, but it was recognized that the stock was in an issue of concern and the commercial fleet didn't fish it. Is that fair to say?
I guess it's fair to say.
Thank you. Mr. Staley, I know one of your complaints about frizzy was not enough Aboriginal consideration in the model. What did the model people need to include an Aboriginal portion to consider it in the model?
One of the things that would have been needed would be a separation of, or an accounting for two different fisheries at least, a minimum of more than one. And currently the model only, in its structure, assumes there is only one fishery.
What do you mean by one fishery?
It means there's only one harvest rate. The harvest rate isn't separated by user group or...
I see. Did the Aboriginal groups give the model makers a number to say this is how many fish you need to build into the model for us?
Not in aggregate, no.
Can you tell me why?
No, I can't tell you why.
But you're the representative in this processes, aren't you?
No, I'm not representing them in the process. I'm assisting the technical aspects and I try and explain those technical aspects to them.
Those are my questions, Commissioner. Thank you.
Mr. Commissioner, Brenda Gertner, and with me Leah Pence for the First Nations Coalition. I just want to clear this up. Mr. Wilson, you gave evidence earlier today that at one point in the Frizzy you were actually there for the UFFCA. As you know, UFFCA is one of my client in the coalition I represent.
Yes, that's correct.
And you're not here representing the UFFCA today in any kind of way, is that correct?
That's correct.
And Mr. Staley, you're also not representing any client base in your evidence today, is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Correct, yes.
All right. Thank you, panel, for being here and working through these issues with us. I just have a couple of initial questions. As I see the Frizzy model and process, I'm going to say that there's a somewhat combination of them both. There's two components that I'm using to understand it. One is the technical considerations that inform the modeling, Mr. Commissioner, and the other is the management objectives or trade-off discussions that also inform the modeling and the outcomes. And I'm going to ask some questions first about the modeling and the technical components, and then I'll turn more to some of the more management objectives and trade-offs discussions. And I want to first ask, what can be done to correct the possible errors associated with the assumptions? Mr. Wilson, perhaps I'll start with you on this. Could I have Exhibit 413 at page 4 and 5? Mr. Wilson, you say it in your report to the UFCA at page 4 and 5 that all the stocks within each timing aggregate have the same time running and are equally vulnerable to each fishery is an assumption. And it's an assumption in that part of the report. And I'll take you to your report. And if we begin at page 4 of the report at the bottom, it's in a section called Inappropriate Assignment of Stocks to Timing Groups. Are you with me, Mr. Wilson?
Yes.
And you see the sentence that it is at the end, the third last sentence of the paragraph. It is assumed that all the stocks.
Yes.
You with me? So it is assumed that all the stocks within each timing aggregate have the same run timing and are equally vulnerable to each fishery. In reality, we know that Fraser Sockeye stocks within the same run timing group can and often do have very different run timing. Depending on the number and timing of fisheries, individual CUs within a timing group can be harvested at very different rates. And then I want to take you one step further in your report. In the next paragraph, you go on to talk about overlaps between these managed stock aggregates. And you'd agree with me that these two concerns are somewhat related?
Yes.
And with me, in the paragraph, you begin at second last sentence again of that paragraph, obvious problems. obvious problems with the assignment of stocks into aggregates were discussed by Dr. Jim Woody in 1996, and as you know, Dr. Woody is going to come here during his tenure as senior biologist for the PSC. Dr. Woody recommended modifications to the stocks included in each group to better reflect their run timing and to improve management control. In the 13 years since Dr. Woody's memo, little has changed. I'm wondering if you could help us understand the nature of that concern as it relates to within the FRSSI model. And then perhaps go one step further and give us some suggestions on how we might improve that.
Well, my concern is not so much with the FRSSI model as the difference between reality and the FRSSI model when you attempt to apply the advice that FRSSI suggests. For example, within the early summer group, we have a range of stocks. The earliest stock to come in from the early summers actually migrates with the early Stewarts. That's the Chilliwack. At the other end of the spectrum, we have Scotch and Seymour, which essentially behave as summer run stocks. Now, when you're managing an aggregate that includes stocks that are overlapping with both early Stewarts and summers, and you have a model that suggests that a fishery will harvest at any particular time during the migration of the early summers, will harvest an equal proportion of each of the stocks within the early summer aggregate, it seems to me a likely source of error in your analysis, because there will be some stocks that will be dominating the early summer run at particular times, and if they happen to be there when your fishery takes place, you'll harvest a much larger proportion of them.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Staley, I'm wondering if you could help a little bit on this topic also. That notion of the overlaps, if I might call it that, amongst the various run timing groups, if I may call it that for a moment, what implications to the modeling that FRSSI uses does this have, and how can we better improve that in the model itself?
Well, it depends on whether you're talking about the model that has been used for the 4 years that we've just come through, or you're talking about the model that has just been retooled and put through, presented to PSARC last year. The new versions of the model are, on this point, are quite different than the version of the model that was used 4 years ago, or 3 or 4 years ago. In the sense that the new model, the computer model, can actually operate on individual groups, so the timing and overlap, if you were to manage them separately, would be not relevant, I suppose. Where the problem is trying to bring that modeled world into some sense of reality where they are overlapped in many of these, in most fisheries, and probably most fisheries, and try and make some sense of the real world, as Mr. Wilson said, and the modeled world. But I think that in terms of improvements to the model, at least one step has been made, and that is to be able to operate the model using on an individual stock basis of the 19 stocks.
Right, so the model is improving, and the task of applying that model is most challenging in season then?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to go now to the second arm of FRSSI, if I may call it that, which is, I understand it, is the identification and consideration of escapement and harvest options, which can be managed after choosing certain options. And I'm just going to summarize a couple of things I've heard from the evidence and move from it and make sure that my summary is correct to start with. As I understand it, there are 3 primary objectives that Mr. Cass, you reviewed for us of the FRSSI model, and Mr. Staley, at page 17 of your report, I also see the performance measures that are related to those. We don't have to take you to that unless it becomes helpful to you, and we can if you want. So we've got the objective of keeping the spawner abundance above the minimum level each year. And I'm assuming the performance model or measurement of that is conservation. Is that a fair summary?
I'd put around that performance measure is trying to represent conservation.
Okay.
Reflect conservation.
All right, and then we have the keep total catch above the minimum level each year, and the performance measure on that would be a stability of supply.
Correct.
And I know this sounds obvious, but I think it's important to put it together from where I'm going. And then the maximum average catch over 50 years, that's another objective of the model, and that again is the stability of supply. It's just over a longer period of time as the performance measure.
Maybe more than stability, it may be actual quantity, the size of it. It's not an objective, it's a performance measure, and there might be objectives associated with catching the most fish over 50 years as opposed to the stability of catch from year to year.
Okay, so I'd like to go one step further now and ask you if it's possible that another objective, and I'm wondering if you could comment on this, Mr. Staley or Mr. Wilson or the panel, that another objective could be ensuring geographic distribution of the stocks throughout the watershed. That's something that actually could be an objective when looking at this type of model. Mr. Wilson?
Yes, we could have as an objective the delivery of some quantum of fish by geographic region. For example, if your interest was in ensuring that First Nations fisheries were able to access the fish they needed.
And Mr. Staley, or if you wanted to add to any of that, is there anything you need to add to that at this point?
Well, just in terms of the version of the model which has was reviewed last year, the only way currently to represent that, calculate that in that calculation framework, would be on by recognizing the stocks where each of the 19 stocks originates, and assume that some portion of the harvest is taking place close to where they originate, and that would generate a distribution of geography.
So that's both the objective and how you measure the objective, if that's correct?
There would have to be an objective about the geography. If there was an objective about the geography, about the distribution in geography, then the current version of the model could partially represent that.
Okay, so the model has that capability. Now, if you added another objective, which would be ensuring fish in order to reach FSC priority fisheries throughout the watershed, could the model be tweaked or adjusted to provide for that?
It might be a challenge in its current form because well, I said it distributional. In order to distribute the fish to the various groups, First Nations groups within the river and outside the river, may require a representation of more than one fishery, and there is a sort of a key technical point in this, that modeling one fishery makes it a lot simpler. Modeling two is might as well model 100. It's the computational and the set of assumptions expand sort of exponentially when you add more fisheries. But in order to represent properly the distribution, for example, of catch in the lower river versus catch in the upper river, you'd have to have more than one fishery.
Mr. Wilson, at page 5 of Exhibit 413, which is your report, you touch on this particular issue, which is you suggest that performance of First Nations fisheries be part of, it's one of the concerns you raise with respect to the model. And at the end of that paragraph, you suggest, in addition to setting minimum benchmarks to protect populations from extinction, it may be appropriate to set minimum abundance levels by geographic area to protect First Nation food fisheries. Do you believe that the model should be adjusted to provide for that, and it could be adjusted to provide that in a meaningful way?
Well, it was my understanding that a model was in preparation at SFU that would try to address that side of the question. So it would follow fish into the river, sequentially harvest them, and look at the patterns of escapement and abundance by geographic region. That's a separate model entirely. I don't know how we would combine the two, but certainly it's been recognized as a shortcoming of the FRSSI model, if you want to call it that, for some time.
That SFU model in a few minutes in another part of my question, so I'll pick that up in a second if I may, Mr. Wilson. Were these objectives, Mr. Cass, to your recollection, the objective of ensuring geographic distribution and the objective of providing FSC priority fisheries raised at any of these earlier workshops? And if so, were they considered by DFO? And even if they weren't raised, given DFO's obligations to First Nations, did you consider those when looking at these models?
That was not considered. There was no consideration for how you might allocate or arrange stocks geographically. The model, as Mr. Staley pointed out, has one harvest rate that is, and any sort of allocation scheme or is beyond what FRSSI was originally designed for.
All right, maybe I'll just pick this up. I know that my clients are concerned with this, and so I need to understand it. Mr. Staley, you raised it briefly, but this model, FRSSI model, is relatively recent. There have been some case law that's been developed around priority of FRSSI fisheries and how that might happen since then. Why was the status quo of one mixed stock fishery used as an assumption within this model, given the complexities of DFO's management obligations? And perhaps I'll start with Mr. Cass and then go to Mr. Staley.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
When you began FRSSI, you were aware of the complexities associated with meeting FSC priority requirements within the Fraser River, and so I'm curious, why, when you began this modeling work, did you assume one mixed stock fishery and have maintained that assumption through the development of the model?
Well, it didn't assume one mixed stock fishery. I mean, it assumed a fishery that, or there could be several fisheries that would be, if you like, you would need to parse out the harvest rate, the harvest rate that FRSSI would produce. So again, it's related to the intent of FRSSI originally was to balance or assess the trade-offs and consequences of a range of harvest options. It was not to go further than that in terms of allocation or specify particular stocks that would be given different weight in the model, although, as I think Mr. Staley pointed out, that could be done depending on the specific objective.
Sorry, I just want to make sure I understand this correct, and Mr. Staley, please correct me if I'm wrong. I've heard the evidence quite a number of times come down to it's assumed that there's one mixed stock fishery in order to run these models.
Well, there is, as Mr. Cass says, it is one harvest rate, and in the computer model, it's just one multiplication of one factor against the population size at the time as you simulate forward. So that one is not divided in any way. And as Mr. Wilson pointed out in his report, the way it was applied is that that one harvest, for any of the aggregates it was operating on all of those aggregates at the same time, the time being a time period of 1 year. So in that sense, they were mixed together. So it was a mixed stock fishery, and there was only one. In part, that was, as Mr. Cass says, it was the intent was to look at the, sort of biologically at the trade-offs on productivity on long-term production of harvest versus escapements and versus spawning, of making those choices, to assist in making those choices. Also, at the time it was developed, I guess since the time it's developed, or at the time it was developed, in order to expand the number of fisheries, in addition to the number of assumptions and data that would be required, which not insurmountable, but would be substantial, there was some constraints on the amount of time that someone was willing to dedicate their computer to it. Some of the original computer runs of this model took several days on some people's laptops.
If I understand, Mr. Wilson, your evidence earlier, and if I've understood this well enough, that other model, so to speak, as to that would bring in these other objectives. Often we've heard through stock assessment, they referred us back to the SFU model, Mr. Commissioner, and we're now being referred back to the SFU model again today in terms of this other model that could help to better understand some of the changes that we may need to see in management. Where would that marriage of these two models best occur? Is it during a FRSSI analysis, or is it during an IFMP analysis? Where does it make the most sense? Or both?
I'm not sure about the IFMP. Certainly many of the people I work with, First Nations, are not engaged in IFMP, so it wouldn't engage the appropriate mix of them if you had to do that. Perhaps an expanded version of FRSSI, or perhaps another process. But there are some technical challenges to, as Mr. Wilson pointed out, some technical challenges to putting the more detailed in-season migration, both with a lot of detail and time and space within season, together with this longer-term view. There are some technical challenges, as I say, probably not insurmountable, but will take some time.
Okay, just before I leave this line of questioning, I just wanted to give Mr. Commissioner an example of something that I expect he'll hear about during the Aboriginal fisheries, which is totally related to what we're talking about. Often Aboriginal people raise a concern around science, around it depends on what question is being asked. And so would you agree with me that even in the creation of the initial models that are being reviewed, that's much informed by the objectives that have been set and the questions that are first asked of the biologists that perform the initial modeling? Is this a good example of that problem? There might be different initial models that are created depending on who's asking the question and depending on the objectives that are being run.
I'm not sure it matters who asks the question, but more what the question is.
What the question is.
And
fair enough.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that. I mean, we saw earlier a document that laid out what were called guiding principles, and they had in them that there would be only four aggregates. I must admit I don't recall reading that in quite stark language. But if that's a principle that was guiding the development of it, then the model has met that guideline, I guess.
All right, thank you. I'm going to next turn my questions to the area around the collaboration on the structured decision-making that is part of the FRSSI model. And in particular, I noted that you, Mr. Cashew, that Department of Fisheries and Oceans efforts around the implementation of FRSSI was largely informed by these workshops that you held in 2007 and 2008. Is it a fair observation to say that in 2007 we did have some technical representatives directly from the groups? I see Pat Matthews is there, Mr. Commissioner has met Pat Matthews, and Gord Starrett is there, Neil Todd is there, Byron Spinks is there. None of these people seem to have attended in the following year. I'm quite sure it's not because they're not interested in salmon. Mr. Staley, could you perhaps comment on why it may be difficult to get these First Nations people to continue to participate in a FRSSI discussion?
Well, it'd be a combination of factors. I recall at I believe it was the 2007 workshops, the workshops that engaged the structured decision-making, whether they were 2007, 2006, I can't recall, but many of the people there, including the ones you listed who are First Nations origin, are really technical people. They're not representing the sort of the positional or interests of their groups. In some cases, they may represent the interests of their group, but that's not broadly representative of the in that context. Much like the question that Mr. Morley responded to earlier, that they were there as participants. They felt very uncomfortable being asked the questions of interest and objective that was being put to them. So I know that some of them decided not to return. The other is that also it's very challenging technical exercise, and some of them thought that their time would be better spent doing something else because they were struggling with understanding some of the concepts. not the concepts, but some of the output and the approaches that are being used.
Mr. Cass, in Exhibit 398, which is the report that was done on this process by Mr. Pestle, Mr. Ryle, and yourself, we've seen a number of times. At page 22 of that report, you're summarizing the challenges associated with what worked well and what needs to be improved. And at the end of the page, page 22, at the bullet that begins the spawning initiative, at the very last sentence, you say, in particular, additional First Nation participants would have been able to provide a more varied perspective on local issues. What steps have DFO taken since the writing of this report to encourage and to try to have First Nations representatives participate in this process?
Yes, Mr. Commissioner, I'm not sure I can give you an answer to that because of my involvement was largely focused on the model and the technical side of it, so I'm not sure what steps might have been taken to help with that particular statement in this.
All right, Mr. Ryle's coming later to talk about these things, so I'll post the question then. Mr. Wilson, do you have anything you'd like to add, any observations that you have with respect to the challenges of First Nations participating in these processes?
Well, I guess my primary concern is that we go the extra mile to make sure that people really understand the tools that are being used to manage their fishery. I recognize how complex the FRSSI model is, but I'm still not prepared to accept the argument that it can't be explained sufficiently so that people can use it. If people don't understand it, then they really shouldn't be using it, because they're really just taking the output from the model as on faith, if you like. And I have a serious concern with that. I think people that are making management decisions about their own fisheries should have the tools in their own hands to evaluate the outcomes of the actions they plan to take. So I think it's critically important that if we're going to go down this road of developing complex computer models to guide our fisheries management decisions, that we at the same time invest a lot of effort in learning how to explain these models to the people that are being affected in language that they can understand.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Staley, I'm just going to pick up this point right here, right now. In your report, you actually go as far as suggesting that the research be done with respect to this. And so there's two things I want to clear up, one of which is Ms. Baker yesterday asked if First Nations are able to understand, and you responded yes. And from there, you were talking about the sheer ability, the brain ability, of course, of First Nations. Am I right on that?
Yes.
Yes. But in your report, you do suggest that it's important to do research, in fact, in how to communicate. That's correct?
Yes.
Now, Mr. Staley, I'm going to make a fair observation about your work, because, as you know, I've watched your work for many years. You're a non-Aboriginal expert who likes to work with numbers and actually understands numbers. And you've stood the test of time in First Nations communities. Those three things are something to note when asking this question. Why is it, given that you have been able to do your best at communicating and you have stood the test of time, that you are recommending research be done on how properly to communicate this? This is not from lack of ability, this is a lack of concern, or this is an actual concern. Am I correct in that?
Yes.
And what do you suggest, what do you think we should be doing to try to better understand how to communicate the implications of these types of modelings on people's ability to fish?
Well, I guess the reason I put research in there is because I don't know. I'd have to research it. I have some ideas that others than people like myself should be engaged in first of all understanding the model and trying to understand how to communicate that to people certainly in First Nation communities who are going to be affected by it and need to understand, as Mr. Wilson said, need to understand how it affects them. So that's what I recall I was meaning by the comment of research, is that we need to spend some time to try and, with the people who know how to speak to these people. That's not the right word, but speak, but also get them to understand as well as I can. I've tried to explain FRSSI in several settings and several workshops over the last 2 or 3 years, and I don't think I've been successful yet. So
is it fair to say that we need to take care to assume that biologists, people that are trained in science, have these skills?
Well, they have some of the skills and have support from people who have the full set of those skills.
I wonder if another one of the challenges associated with the communication is access to the right First Nations people in a timely manner. So I'm going to switch it now. We've talked about the challenges of the communicator. Now I'm going to talk about the challenges associated with who's being communicated to. So would you agree that some of it also includes challenges associated with getting consistent representatives at the meetings on behalf of First Nations who have mandates?
Oh, yes, that is true, yes.
And would you also agree that the challenge is having leadership attend alongside technical support when trade-off discussions are occurring?
Yes.
And Mr. Wilson, would you also agree that the implications of these options may be very different depending on the First Nations interests that are being considered?
Yes, I would.
And Mr. Staley, would you also agree with me on that?
Yes.
I know. Mr. Wilson, I know that you're under extreme time pressures and you need to leave. Would you like to stay or would you like to leave? And if I can do my best to ask the rest of the questions of the panel and
Sure,
anything
that's
else I
fine.
pick up with you tomorrow, would you prefer that?
Yeah, tomorrow I'll be here.
All right, I'll do that. Finish with, if there's any further questions I have of Mr. Wilson on these topics, then I'll pick it up with him tomorrow, Mr. Commissioner, if that's agreeable.
Mr. Wilson, do you have a couple more minutes?
Yes.
I just wanted to ask one query while he's here, and
Please.
with these panel members, if I might, and I
Yes.
apologize for interrupting
No.
Ms. Gardner.
Please.
I just wanted to pick up on something that Mr. Eidsvik asked the panel and see if I can get an understanding of your answer to him. He asked why FRSSI, and I don't mean to be overly simplistic, and I don't mean any insult to him. He gave more than that, but essentially that was the topic. And then he went back and you heard his historical references, and I think Mr. Morley, you picked up on the historical references. In tab 6 of your binder, which is the CSAP working paper at page it's under 2 methods. I'm not sure. The page number is 5, I think. After talking about what FRSSI does, it then says what it doesn't. And you talked about, Mr. Wilson and the other members of the panel talked about this earlier today, but it says, however, the current model is not set up to address the following: in-season management strategies. And I may be misunderstanding the dialogue between yourselves and Mr. Eidsvik, but if it's not dealing with in-season management strategies, how is it different than pre-FRSSI in terms of managing the in-season fishery? If this model is not designed, and it says it here, to address, not deal with, but address in-season management strategies, alternative fishing plans, catch sharing, annual adjustments, how is it different than pre-FRSSI for in-season management? Because that's where I'm a bit lost in the exchange you had with Mr. Eidsvik. You're saying it's needed, and you said why it's needed, what the changes were, what it was addressing in terms of the changes, and yet here it says it's not dealing with in-season management. So it either is or it isn't.
Mr. Commissioner, I wonder if I could ask one question in addition to that may be helpful to that question and the panel, which is, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, there is a guiding rule as to the total annual mortality that comes out of FRSSI that is actually applied in season. How it's applied and the variations that are determined in season is still the challenge of managers, but that is a rule that through the FRSSI we take into in-season. Mr. Staley, since you're on the Fraser River panel, you might be the best to answer that question.
I'm on the technical committee. Mr. Morley's on the panel.
Oh, Mr. Morley is on the panel, so that could be helpful.
Yes, that's the case. I mean, The FRSSI is as I said before, FRSSI is used before the season. In season, it's the results of FRSSI that are used as guidelines to guide, but not. But the model itself is not used in season to do any other calculations. The calculations that are used in season are using the agreed to, or the preseason TAM rule, which is informed by the FRSSI process and established by the minister now as guidelines for doing the calculations for what is the allowable catch at any point during the season.
So we don't make adjustments to the TAM rule in season any longer. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Is that helpful, Mr. Commissioner?
Well, it does, because does that mean that there should be an amendment to this statement, or it's still a clear statement?
No, that's from my point of view as a panel member, that it is definitely a clear statement, and I think the distinction that was being drawn before is that we're through this process, through the FRSSI process, we're developing these TAM rules for each of the 4 run timing groups, which are then fixed, and it's based on this long-term 48-year projection as to what, given all the uncertainty and the variables and the potential changes, what the strategy over the long term what the implications might be for these populations and given their population dynamics. That, as Mr. Staley indicates, informs the decision that's made on the rule. Once the rule is put in for each of the 4 run timing groups, regardless of what we actually see come back in that given year, if based on the actual experience in season, you might want to make a different decision, FRSSI isn't used for that, isn't set up to analyze that. It only analyzes this long-term kind of approach to things. And previously, we might change our management based on the relative strengths of the particular run timing groups that were coming back in that particular year. With this current approach that's inspired by FRSSI, we have these fixed rules that don't change.
So, based upon historical data, you're able to project, and do I take it there's a consensus on the panel? That's why I wanted Mr. Wilson to hear that this model, which uses historical data to project into the future, but then fixes the TAM for the annual assessment, is a better management model than was there pre-FRSSI. Is that what you're saying? It's a model. I think Mr. Cass has said many, many times it's just a model, but it's being used, and it's being used, as you're telling me now, to fix the TAM for in-season management. So you're saying, based on historical data, but projecting 48 years into the future, using the TAM for in-season management, that's a better model than pre-FRSSI. I'm just curious as that's something that would help me understand your dialogue with Mr. Eisvik.
I would agree that it's a better model for 2 reasons. One is that the exploitation rates are generally lower. The other is that the TAM rule allows us to set maximum mortalities and accounts for fish that might disappear on the way to the spawning grounds. So we don't harvest fish and later find out that even more are missing and see shortfalls on the grounds. We estimate as well as possible how many fish may disappear or be unaccounted for on their homeward migration, and we reduce fishing pressure to compensate. So I think for those reasons particularly, it's an improvement. It's a step in the right direction.
Thank you.
I would say that it's telling that Mr. Wilson's first response as to why it's a better model is because he's looking at results from his point of view, which is he wants to see more escapement and exploitation rates are lower. So I think that, again, from my point of view, I think it is a model that tries to capture more of the changes that we've seen in the environment than were there previously. And so it tries to deal with things like en route mortality and certainly does a better job of understanding what's happening with the population dynamics. In terms of making decisions as to what the best strategy is for balancing escapement needs, biodiversity versus yield, I think it has some serious deficiencies that need to be looked at, and so there are some explicit trade-offs made that rule out a lot of the analysis of some of the options. For example, we talked about having a maximum 60% TAM rule and in our discussions yesterday, and there's no analysis within this process to what might be the implications of a maximum 65% or a maximum of 70% or 80. It's just sort of been taken off the table, and there's no analysis at all done. So from that point of view, we're limiting the options, and we're limiting the information that's being put in front of decision makers. So while it might characterize the underlying biology better, it's I think a not a very good way to analyze this trade-off currently between yield and biodiversity.
Mr. Wilson, thank you very much for your patience. I realize you have to leave, and thank you to the panel members for those answers.
I just want to pick up on this discussion again, if I may. One more further question. It seems to me that one of the possible benefits of having some rules before you go into in-season is the complexities of in-season. And so we've at least established a guideline in-season, one less variable. Would you agree with me that that's useful during the in-season hecticness of management? Now, Mr. Staley and Mr. Morley?
Well, it does sort of take one of the moving balls off the table, so we can focus on the other ones. But that being well, the other thing it does is it provides for those who are outside the room which much of this decision making is taking place, such as both inside of DFO and the Fraser and at times in the Fraser panel. It provides some understanding of what the goalposts and what the guidelines are for those decisions to those who are affected by it but don't follow it as closely as people like myself and Mr. Morley. So it's important from that perspective.
Mr. Morley, would you agree that helping to determine some goalposts prior to in-season is useful?
I think absolutely trying to set out some goalposts and some ways in which you're going to evaluate changes to those goalposts is something useful to do ahead of the season, yes.
Thank you. Just while we're on that topic, there is this move from FRSSI to the IFMP, and then we're in season. How has the FRSSI process and the work that's been done helped to inform perhaps the usefulness of more concrete or transparent guidelines for in-season decisions?
Could you ask me again?
All right, you've done some work across, you're struggling with representation from First Nations. We've heard that evidence, but let's assume that for a moment. You're doing work cross-sectorally and with the department to establish certain rules and guidelines that help to make decisions in season. From that experience, with participating in that process, would it be useful to have clearer in-season guidelines or decision-making structures that you would implement? And having had the FRSSI experience, what type of guidelines would be useful? And you're using objectives and performance measures, and you're trying to use both of those actively. Would that be useful for in-season discussions and guidelines associated with that at the Fraser panel?
It might be useful. I expect that the pace at which decisions get made in season, it would be a challenge to implement an analysis, a sort of a real-time analysis of the type and debate and discussion of the type that what goes on what did go on in the development of the work associated with FRSSI. That being said, I guess as Mr. Morley said, that there also needs the guidelines and goalposts that are set up pre-season, we've had some experience that that there may be reasonable reasons to adjust them in season, and we don't have a transparent process in order to do that now. And so perhaps some work on the how to, in addition to guidelines like FRSSI and other parts that are in the IFMP, there's some mechanism that can make adjustments to that, but that the others who are not in the room are made aware of, and I don't like the word transparency either, but are available to and accessible to others who are going to be affected by it.
Mr. Morley?
I would agree with that.
Thank you. Just turning briefly, I know that the logic of the order is a bit skewed because I was trying to get Mr. Wilson out of the room. I want to go back to the generation of the options, and I just want to ask some basic questions. Who does the initial short list of these options? Is that a DFO exercise? So you could have 150 options, as I understand it from the evidence. The modelers might have fun doing that, but you don't come up to the first meeting with 150 options. You come down with 3 to 5, as I understand it. Who selects those 3 to 5?
I'm thinking back a few years now, but it's in the 2008 report with the Pestle et al. That there is a working group. Cross-sectoral working group. Now, I had to think back when I read that about what that really meant. But in that report, there was some choices made annually based on the outputs from FRSSI to render down the number of choices to some options. And part of this was in 2007, I think, was also. This so-called structured decision-making was designed to, if you like, separate the important from the unimportant based on the preferences that were explored then. Others might have a...
Yeah, it's my recollection that the set of options that emerged for the early part of the implementation of FRSSI, which would have been 2006, 2007, were discussed and I guess reviewed in these workshops that have been identified. Since then, it's my understanding that it's been basically those the sort of general character of those options hasn't changed very much, and there's been some slight alterations, but they've been basically carried forward, and the process of doing that's been done internally in DFO for 2009, 2010, I think. Was my understanding that the original implementation was going to be for one cycle, 2006, 2010, and there was going to be a process to review it for 2011, which I guess, given where we are in the season and what people's schedule is already, is unlikely to happen before the 2011 season, by my understanding. But maybe I'll be surprised.
Hearing will now recess for 10 minutes.